Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Valiant watching the empty space ahead when the alarm started screaming, and his crew jumped to their stations with practiced speed that came from years of military training and the kind of discipline that kept people alive in the cold darkness between stars where one mistake could kill everyone aboard the holographic display lit up with warnings as something massive dropped out of hyperspace, just outside Earth's defensive perimeter. And Lisa Grant felt her heart skip a beat as she stared at the readings that made no sense according to everything humanity knew about physics and space travel and alien technology. The ship that appeared before them was unlike anything in Earth's extensive databases of known alien vessels, and it gleamed like crystal under the distant light of Sol while radiating energy signatures that made their most advanced sensors shriek warnings about power levels that should have been impossible for any ship to contain without tearing itself apart. Jake moved closer to the main screen as his communications officer tried to establish contact with the unknown vessel, and after several long minutes of static and electronic noise, a signal came through that made everyone on the bridge freeze in place because it was speaking broken English with words that sounded like they had been pieced together from intercepted human broadcasts. The being that appeared on their screen was tall and graceful, with 4 arms that moved like water and skin that shimmered like liquid mercury under starlight, and her voice carried a desperation that needed no translation as she spoke in halting words that came from a throat not designed for human speech. She called herself High Coordinator Zathara of the Kalari Empire, and as she spoke, Jake could see the exhaustion and fear in her alien features that told him this was no trick or deception but a genuine plea for help from beings who had nowhere else to turn and no other options left to try the story she told made Jake's blood run cold as he listened to her explain how an ancient force called the Devourers had awakened from the galactic core where they had slept for millions of years and were now spreading across the galaxy like a plague that consumed everything in its path. These entities were not just conquerors or invaders, but something far worse, because they literally devoured entire star systems and converted all matter into pure energy for their hive mind collective that grew stronger with every world they consumed and every civilization they destroyed. Zethra showed them images of worlds that had once been green and beautiful, now reduced to empty space where nothing remained but cosmic dust and the bitter taste of defeat that came from watching everything you loved disappear into the hunger of beings that could not be reasoned with or negotiated with or stopped by conventional weapons. 17 major civilizations had already fallen, including the mighty Kalari Empire that once ruled a quarter of the galaxy with technology so advanced that they could reshape planets and create artificial stars, but none of their weapons had been able to slow the Devourers down for even a single day. The transmission ended with Zathara's desperate plea for humanity to help them fight against these cosmic horrors, even though she admitted that Earth's military seemed primitive compared to the forces that had already failed, and she knew that asking for help from such a young species was probably pointless, but they had no other choice. Back on Earth, President Nathan Cole called an emergency session of the United Earth Council, and within hours the most powerful leaders in human civilization were gathered in the secured chambers beneath New Geneva listening to Admiral Susan Hayes brief them on humanity's military capabilities. The numbers were not encouraging when compared to the cosmic threat they now faced, and their most powerful weapons seemed like children's toys against entities that could consume entire star systems and had already destroyed civilizations with millions of years of technological advancement. Yet something stirred in human hearts as they listened to the briefing and watched the recordings that Zathara had shared, and instead of the fear and despair that had consumed other species when faced with the Devourers, humanity began to feel something different. Dr. Marcus Webb studied the data that Zathara had provided, and while other scientists might have been overwhelmed by the scale of the threat, he found himself growing excited rather than afraid as he analyzed the biological signatures and energy patterns of their enemies. He stood before the council with a confidence that surprised everyone, including himself, and declared that the Devourers were not invincible gods, but living creatures with biological processes and energy requirements, and most importantly, They had weaknesses that could be exploited by beings smart enough to find them. The room fell silent as Webb continued his analysis and explained that everything biological had vulnerabilities, and the key to defeating the Devourers lay not in matching their power, but in understanding their nature and finding ways to disrupt the systems that kept them alive and functioning. President Cole looked around the room at the faces of humanity's leaders and saw something that had never existed before in the history of Earth civilization, because for the first time in their species' existence they were united by a common enemy that threatened not just their world but their very right to exist. The vote was unanimous, and within hours, humanity began preparing for a war against enemies they had never seen while fighting alongside allies they barely knew, for stakes higher than any human conflict in history. And as the preparations began, Jake Morrison looked out at the stars and wondered if they were brave enough or crazy enough to save a galaxy that had already given up hope. The Galactic Remnant Alliance had chosen Sanctuary Prime as their meeting place because it was the most heavily defended world in known space and surrounded by the combined technology of 7 surviving civilizations who had managed to escape the Devourers long enough to build this fortress planet that existed in a pocket of folded space where normal physics worked differently. Admiral Tony Clark arrived at Sanctuary Prime aboard the UES Defiance, which was humanity's most advanced warship, but looked like a crude metal box compared to the sleek energy constructs and living ships that belonged to the other species who had answered the call for this desperate alliance meeting. The alien leaders were waiting in the Great Council Chamber, which was a massive crystalline dome that could accommodate beings of different atmospheric requirements and gravitational needs. And as Tony entered the room, he could feel the weight of their stares and the unmistakable sense that humanity was being judged and found wanting. Council Prime Vexthal of the Zephyrian Confederacy was the first to speak, and his words came through a translator device that turned his complex, harmonic communications into flat human speech that barely concealed his condescension and disappointment with what Earth had sent to represent their species in this critical moment. The Zephyrians had controlled 300 star systems before the Devourers came, and their technology was so advanced that they could manipulate gravity itself and create weapons that fired compressed space-time. But even they had been forced to flee when the cosmic horrors arrived at their borders. Vexel gestured toward a holographic display that showed the pathetic size of humanity's territory compared to the vast empires that had already fallen, and his tone made it clear that he considered this meeting a waste of precious time that could have been spent on evacuation planning. General Amy Foster stepped forward, and Tony could see the alien leaders reacting to her presence with what their translators indicated was a mixture of curiosity and amusement, because she was clearly a warrior but carried weapons that seemed primitive even by the standards of species that had been spacefaring for only a few centuries. Amy had led humanity through the colony wars and the resource conflicts and the Martian rebellion, and she knew something about fighting enemies who seemed impossible to defeat, and she had learned that the most dangerous mistake any military leader could make was underestimating their own capabilities. She looked around the room at the gathered representatives of civilizations that spanned thousands of worlds and had histories stretching back millions of years, and she spoke in a voice that carried the quiet confidence of someone who had never learned how to surrender. The proud Nexari flickered with energy patterns that their translators said indicated amusement, and they were beings of pure electromagnetic force who could exist in the vacuum of space and manipulate matter at the molecular level, but even they had been driven from their home dimensions by the Devourers. The collective chorus was a hive mind species that could coordinate the actions of billions of individual bodies across multiple star systems, and they had fought the Devourers with perfect tactical coordination, but had still been forced to retreat when their enemies adapted to their strategies faster than they could implement new ones. Captain Roy Baker commanded Earth's Special Operations Division, and while the aliens continued their debate about evacuation routes and surrender terms, he was studying the tactical displays that showed Devourer movement patterns and attack sequences that had been recorded during the fall of 17 civilizations, what the aliens saw as unstoppable destruction. Roy recognized as predictable behavior patterns that followed military logic and strategic principles that any human soldier would understand. And he realized that the galaxy's great civilizations had made the fatal mistake of trying to fight the Devourers like a natural disaster instead of an enemy army. Dr. Helen Stone was humanity's chief engineer, and she had been examining the captured Devourer technology samples that the Alliance had managed to recover from destroyed worlds, and while the aliens looked at these artifacts with mystical awe, she saw them as machines with components and power sources and operational requirements. The alien technology was certainly more advanced than anything humanity had ever built, but Helen had spent her career reverse engineering alien devices, and she knew that every machine had weaknesses and failure points and ways to be disrupted if you understood the principles behind their operation. She began running calculations on her portable computer, while the aliens continued their discussion about which sectors of the galaxy might offer temporary refuge and which species had fast enough ships to outrun the approaching Devourer fleets that were consuming worlds at an accelerating pace. Council Prime Vexville returned his attention to the human delegation and asked what exactly their primitive species thought they could contribute to a war against entities that had defeated civilizations with technology spanning millions of years of development and weapons that could crack planets in half. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Tony could see that this was the moment when humanity would either be accepted as a legitimate member of the Alliance or dismissed as irrelevant primitives who had no place in a conflict of this magnitude. Amy Foster smiled, and it was the kind of expression that had made enemy commanders nervous during every conflict she had ever fought, and she answered in words that would be remembered long after the war was over and the galaxy had learned to fear and respect the species that refused to run away. She told them that humanity offered something the galaxy had apparently forgotten how to do, and something that might be the key to turning the tide against enemies who had grown overconfident from millions of years of easy victories against civilizations that had never learned how to fight back with the kind of desperation that came from having nothing left to lose. The room fell silent as the translation devices struggled to convey the full meaning of her words, and Tony realized that they were witnessing the moment when humanity announced its arrival on the galactic stage, not as supplicants begging for acceptance, but as warriors offering to lead a counterattack that would either save the galaxy or die trying. While the galaxy's surviving civilizations continued their endless debates about evacuation protocols and surrender negotiations, Earth underwent a transformation that would have been impossible for any other species in galactic history, because humanity possessed something that their alien allies had lost after millions of years of advanced civilization and comfortable security. Colonel Steve Adams watched from his command center as every major manufacturing facility on Earth converted from civilian production to military hardware in a matter of weeks, and the speed of this transformation amazed even him because he had never seen an entire planet's industrial capacity mobilized with such efficiency and determination. The factories that had once produced consumer goods and luxury items now churned out ammunition and armor, plating and weapon components, while the research facilities that had been working on medical advances and entertainment technology redirected their efforts toward developing new ways to kill entities that could devour star systems. Children learned to assemble ammunition between their regular classes, and elderly citizens volunteered for factory work that would have exhausted people half their age. And former enemy nations shared their most classified military secrets without hesitation, because humanity had finally found an enemy that made their previous conflicts seem like minor disagreements. Dr. Gary Phillips led a team of quantum physicists who were working to weaponize humanity's understanding of dimensional mechanics, and if the Devourers could manipulate space-time to travel instantly between stars, then humans would learn to collapse that same space-time around them and trap them in normal reality where conventional weapons might actually work. The research progressed at a pace that violated every safety protocol and academic standard, but Gary knew that they were racing against time because the Devourer fleets were moving through the galaxy faster than anyone had predicted, and Earth needed weapons that could kill gods before those gods arrived to consume. Saw Captain Lucy Morgan ran the recruitment centers that processed volunteers at rates that stunned the alien observers who had been assigned to monitor Earth's war preparations, and she had never seen anything like the response from ordinary civilians who were signing up to fight enemies. They could barely comprehend farmers and teachers and shopkeepers, and students stood in lines that stretched for blocks waiting their turn to volunteer for military service, and when Lucy asked them why they were willing to die for aliens they had never met, the answers were always some variation of the same basic human principle that evil should be stopped regardless of the cost. But it was Professor Don Miller's breakthrough that changed everything when he completed his analysis of the Devourer biological samples and discovered something that the galaxy's greatest scientists had missed during their millions of years of advanced research and technological development. The Devourers were not pure energy beings as everyone had assumed, but were actually biological entities with physical anchor points in normal space-time that allowed them to maintain coherence while manipulating cosmic forces, and this meant they could be killed if you knew where to aim. Dan stood before the Emergency War Council and explained his findings with the kind of excited energy that came from solving a puzzle that had seemed impossible, and he showed them detailed scans that revealed the Devourers' true nature as parasites with incredibly advanced technology rather than unstoppable forces of cosmic destruction. Admiral Kevin White began implementing humanity's three-phase battle plan that had been developed based on Dan's discoveries and centuries of human military experience fighting enemies who seemed impossible to defeat, and the plan was simple enough that every soldier could understand it and complex enough that it might actually work. Phase 1 involved hitting the Devourers where they did not expect resistance and using their overconfidence against them, because beings who had conquered 17 civilizations without serious opposition would not be prepared for enemies who fought back with the kind of vicious determination that characterized human warfare. Phase 2 required forcing the Devourers to fight on human terms by using dimensional anchor technology to trap them in normal space-time where their cosmic powers would be limited, and they would have to face weapons that had been specifically designed to kill biological entities with physical forms. Phase 3 was the part of the plan that Admiral White did not discuss with the Alien Alliance because it involved making the Devourers regret ever hearing of Earth, and humanity had learned long ago that some military strategies were too brutal to share with allies who might not understand the necessity of total warfare. The Alien Alliance was not consulted about humanity's preparations because Earth's military leadership had concluded that committees were fundamentally incapable of winning wars, and that the kind of decisive action needed to defeat the Devourers required unity of command and willingness to make hard choices without debate. Commander Beth Turner ran Earth's intelligence division, and her teams had managed to intercept Devourer communications by using quantum entanglement techniques that the aliens considered impossible, and what they learned from these transmissions was both encouraging and terrifying. The Devourers were discussing Earth with casual dismissal, and they planned to consume the Sol system as a minor snack while their main forces finished harvesting the more advanced civilizations that were still fleeing toward the galaxy's outer rim, where they hoped to find safety in the empty spaces between stars. Intercepted communications revealed that the Devourers considered humanity too primitive to pose any real threat, and were planning to send only a small harvesting fleet to deal with Earth, while their primary forces continued pursuing the refugee convoys that contained the galaxy's most advanced technology and largest populations. This intelligence was exactly what humanity's military planners had been hoping to hear, because it meant the Devourers would arrive at Earth overconfident and unprepared for the kind of reception that awaited them, and it also meant that humanity would have the element of surprise for at least the opening phases of the battle. Beth compiled her intelligence reports and sent them to every command center on Earth and throughout the Sol system, where military installations were being constructed at a pace that defied both physics and common sense as humanity prepared to fight the first major battle in their species' war against the galaxy's nightmares, the Preparations continued around the clock as Earth transformed itself into something that had never existed before in galactic history, and when the alien observers filed their reports with the Remnant Alliance, they struggled to find words that could adequately describe what they were witnessing on this small primitive world that refused to accept defeat. The Devourers arrived at the Kepler 442 system with the casual confidence of predators who had never encountered serious resistance, and they moved through space like living mountains of dark energy that bent reality around them as they approached. What they expected to find was another helpless collection of fleeing refugees and primitive defenders. Admiral Carl Johnson commanded the human fleet from the bridge of the UES Retribution, which had been built specifically for this war using every piece of alien technology that Earth's engineers could understand and weaponize, and the ship bristled with systems that no galactic civilization had ever thought to combine in a single vessel. The Devourer entities each measured roughly the size of small moons, and they radiated power signatures that made space itself ripple with distortions that should have been impossible according to conventional physics, but they moved with lazy arrogance that told Carl everything he needed to know about their psychological state. These cosmic horrors had absorbed the weapons and knowledge of 17 advanced civilizations, and they had grown so accustomed to easy victories that they no longer bothered to scout their targets or prepare for serious resistance, and this overconfidence was exactly what humanity's battle planners had been counting on. Captain Ryan Cross commanded the first wave attack formation, and his ships carried weapons that the galaxy's scientists had dismissed as primitive throwbacks to an earlier age of warfare, but Ryan knew something that the advanced civilizations had forgotten during their millions of years of energy-based combat. Nuclear weapons were not elegant or sophisticated, but they were incredibly good at converting matter into energy in ways that could disrupt even the most advanced defensive systems, and when those weapons were delivered by kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed, they became something that could challenge even cosmic entities. The Devourers detected the approaching human fleet, and their response was to continue their leisurely advance toward what they assumed were conventional energy weapons that would be absorbed by their dimensional shields. Just like every other attack they had ever faced in 10 million years of galactic conquest, they were catastrophically wrong about what humanity had prepared for them. And their first hint of this came when Ryan's tactical nuclear warheads detonated not against their shields but in carefully calculated positions around the space-time distortions that the entities used for faster-than-light TRAVLDR. Phillips dimensional disruption torpedoes followed immediately behind the nuclear strikes, and instead of trying to damage the Devourers directly, these weapons were designed to collapse the folded space around the entities and trap them in normal reality, where the laws of physics worked the way humans understood them. For the first time in their existence, spanning millions of years and countless galactic conquests, the Devourers found themselves unable to phase through attacks or manipulate space-time to avoid damage, and they experienced something that their hive mind collective had never felt before, which was genuine surprise at meeting resistance. They could not simply ignore the trapped entities began to respond with the kind of devastating energy attacks that had reduced advanced civilizations to cosmic dust, but they discovered that human ships were built using principles that prioritized survival over elegance and armor plating over energy efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Joan Davis led the fighter squadrons that swarmed around the trapped Devourers like angry insects, and her pilots had trained for months to execute attack patterns that other species would have considered suicide missions because they involved flying directly into the energy fields that surrounded the cosmic entities. The human fighters did not try to engage in honorable combat or minimize their own casualties because they had been trained by instructors who understood that war was not a game with rules but a contest between survival and extinction, where the only victory that mattered was the one that left your enemies dead. Jones pilots flew explosive-laden ships directly into the weak points that Dr. Miller had identified in the Devourer biological structures, and they detonated their weapons at ranges that guaranteed their own destruction but also guaranteed maximum damage to targets that had never been seriously injured before. The Battle continued for 14 hours as human ships threw themselves against entities that could manipulate cosmic forces, and the space around Kepler 442 became a graveyard filled with the wreckage of vessels from both sides as humanity proved that even gods could bleed if you were willing to pay the price, and Blood Admiral Johnson watched the tactical displays as his fleet suffered casualties that would have broken the morale of any other military force in galactic history, but his crews continued, fighting with a determination that the Devourer hive mind could not understand because it defied all logical calculations about acceptable losses. The turning point came when Captain Sarah Martinez managed to ram her heavy cruiser directly into the core structure of a wounded Devourer entity, and the resulting explosion tore a hole in space-time that allowed the creature's energy matrix to dissipate into cosmic background radiation. The death of the first Devourer in 10 million years sent shock waves through their collective consciousness, and for the first time since their awakening they experienced something that they had never felt before, which was the fear that they might not be invincible after all two more Devourer entities fell to human attacks before the survivors managed to retreat into hyperspace and escape the trap that humanity had set for them. And when the battle finally ended, Carl Johnson surveyed a battlefield littered with the wreckage of 60% of his fleet, but also containing the corpses of 3 cosmic entities that had been considered unstoppable. The victory came at a terrible cost, but it proved something that changed the balance of power in the galaxy, because for the first time since the Devourers had begun their rampage across known space, they had been not just stopped but actually killed by beings they had dismissed as primitive and irrelevant across the galaxy. Every surviving civilization's monitoring stations detected the impossible energy signatures that indicated Devourer deaths, and the news spread through the refugee fleets like wildfire, as species that had given up all hope suddenly realized that the cosmic nightmares that had destroyed their worlds were not invincible gods but mortal enemies that could be fought and killed. The Devourer collective experienced something it had never felt in its millions of years of existence as it processed the loss of 3 entities to creatures it had barely considered worthy of notice, and that emotion was surprise, followed quickly by something even more dangerous, which was the decision to abandon their systematic harvesting in favor of direct retaliation against the species that had dared to kill their own. The Devourer response was swift and overwhelming, as hundreds of cosmic entities that had been systematically harvesting the galaxy's outer reaches suddenly changed direction and began converging on the Sol system with a focus and intensity that they had never shown toward any previous target in their 10-million-year history of galactic conquest. Admiral Patricia Moore received the long-range sensor data aboard the UES Vengeance, and the readings showed energy signatures approaching Earth that represented more destructive power than all 17 fallen civilizations had been able to muster in their final desperate battles, and she smiled with the grim satisfaction of someone whose tactical predictions had proven correct. The psychological warfare experts had been right when they predicted that killing the Devourer scouts would provoke the entities into abandoning their careful, systematic approach in favor of emotional retaliation, and this was exactly the kind of tactical mistake that humanity had been hoping their enemies would make. General Chris Allen activated Phase 2 of Earth's defense plan, and every human installation throughout the Sol system began revealing weapons and defensive systems that had been carefully hidden during months of preparation, while alien observers had been led to believe that humanity's military capabilities were limited to conventional ships and energy weapons. Mars had been transformed into a fortress world with surface installations that could accelerate projectiles to relativistic speeds using gravitational slingshots, and the asteroid belt had been converted into a defensive network of weapons platforms that could coordinate their fire to create killing fields throughout the inner system. The outer planets bristled with installations that used Jupiter's gravity well to launch kinetic projectiles on trajectories that would intersect Devourer approach vectors, and Saturn's rings had been seeded with mines that would detonate when cosmic entities tried to use the planet's mass to alter their course toward Earth. But the true surprise was waiting beneath Earth's oceans, where DR Stone's engineering teams had spent months converting the planet's water into a massive, dimensional anchor field that would trap any entity trying to phase through the planet's defenses and hold them in normal space-time. Where human weapons could actually hurt them, the Devourer swarm arrived at the outer edge of the Sol system, and their first action was to attempt the same phase shift maneuver that had allowed them to bypass the defenses of 17 civilizations, but instead of slipping through Earth's protective network, they found themselves pulled into normal reality and held there by forces they could not understand. Captain Neil Roberts launched the counterattack from Luna Base as human ships erupted from hidden positions throughout the solar system and surrounded the trapped entities in a sphere of concentrated firepower that had been planned and rehearsed for months. While the galaxy's refugees had been debating evacuation strategies, the Devourers discovered that humanity had studied every previous battle that had been recorded by the fleeing civilizations, and had analyzed every weakness and tactical error that had led to the fall of 17 advanced species, and had prepared countermeasures for every strategy that the cosmic entities had used before Colonel Tracy Wilson commanded the ground forces that engaged Devourer landing attempts on Earth itself when some of the smaller entities managed to break through the orbital defenses, and her soldiers fought with an emotional intensity that the cold, logical calculations of the Hive Mind Collective could not comprehend. The human defenders used weapons that other galactic civilizations had banned as war crimes, and they employed tactics that ignored every conventional rule of engagement because they were fighting not just for military victory, but for the right of their species to continue existing in a universe that seemed determined to destroy them. Tracy's troops carried nuclear demolition charges into close combat with entities that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, and they detonated those weapons at ranges that guaranteed their own deaths, but also inflicted damage that the Devourers had never experienced from ground-based forces. The battle for Earth lasted 3 weeks as wave after wave of cosmic entities threw themselves against defenses that seemed impossible for such a primitive species to have constructed, and the space around Sol became a graveyard filled with the energy signatures of dead gods and the wreckage of human ships that had died. Killing them, Admiral Johnson's replacement, Admiral Kate Foster, coordinated the defense from a command bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, and she watched the tactical displays as humanity's carefully prepared trap closed around enemies who had expected to find easy prey but instead discovered predators that fought harder than they did. The Devourers began using weapons that could crack planets in half, but they discovered that Earth's defensive systems included gravitational manipulators that could deflect even cosmic-scale attacks, and dimensional shields that had been reverse-engineered from captured alien technology and improved by human engineers who understood warfare in ways that peaceful civilizations never could. DR Webb's Biological Warfare Division released engineered viruses into the local space around Earth that were specifically designed to attack the quantum consciousness matrices that held the Devourer Collective together, and these weapons spread through the enemy ranks like a plague that targeted their ability to coordinate attacks. The turning point came when Captain Diana Ross led a suicide squadron directly into the largest Devourer entity and detonated a dimensional collapse bomb that had been built using principles that humanity barely understood, but that tore a hole in space, time large enough to destabilize the creature's energy matrix. The death of their largest entity sent shock waves through the Devourer Collective that caused them to experience something they had never felt in their millions of years of existence, which was genuine fear of creatures that they had originally dismissed as irrelevant primitives, who would be consumed without difficulty. More entities fell to human attacks as Earth's defenders proved that they possessed something that the galaxy's advanced civilizations had lost during their millions of years of peaceful development, which was the willingness to accept any casualty rate and pay any price to achieve victory against enemies that threatened their existence. When the battle finally ended, the Devourer Collective had lost over half of their primary swarm, and more critically, they had learned that humanity would not run from superior force and would not surrender when faced with impossible odds, and would not show mercy to enemies that had consumed billions of innocent beings. The cosmic entities retreated from the Sol system, but their withdrawal was not the strategic repositioning that they had used against other species, but the desperate flight of predators, who had finally encountered prey that fought back harder and more viciously than they did. The galaxy's surviving civilizations monitored the energy signatures from the Battle of Earth, and they realized that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power, because a species that had been dismissed as primitive newcomers had just defeated the greatest threat that known space had ever faced, using weapons and tactics that defied conventional military wisdom. The aftermath of Earth's victory sent shock waves through the galaxy as surviving civilizations that had been fleeing in terror for months suddenly stopped running and began asking themselves why they had never thought to fight back against enemies that could apparently be killed by beings with primitive technology and sufficient determination. Admiral Frank Turner commanded the human fleet that prepared for the final offensive against the Devourer's stronghold in the galactic core, and his ships no longer resembled the crude metal boxes that had first answered the galaxy's desperate plea for help, but had evolved into something that made even humanity's alien allies nervous when they watched them in action. The vessels under Frank's command carried weapons that had never been tested in combat because they were too dangerous to use anywhere near inhabited worlds, and these devices could collapse stars and tear holes in the fabric of space time itself, and were built by engineers who had learned to combine human military doctrine with captured alien technology. Captain Sandra Price led the assault marines who would spearhead the attack on the Devourer hive stations, and her troops had been transformed by months of constant warfare from ordinary soldiers into something that resembled the cosmic entities they fought. In terms of ruthless efficiency and complete disregard for conventional rules of engagement, the human fleet was no longer the desperate collection of defenders who had first faced the Devourers at Kepler 442, but had become apex predators in their own right, and they moved through space with the confidence of beings who had learned that even gods could be hunted and killed if you understood their weaknesses. Dr. Webb now wore the uniform of a military researcher rather than a civilian scientist, and he had developed weapons that pushed the boundaries of what galactic civilizations considered morally acceptable, because his virus programs were specifically designed to attack the quantum consciousness that linked the Devourer collective together. The biological warfare systems that Webb had created were works of art that combined advanced science with pure hatred, and they were engineered to cause maximum suffering to entities that had consumed billions of innocent beings without mercy or remorse, and they represented humanity's declaration that some enemies deserved to suffer. The final offensive began when Frank's fleet struck at the outer defenses of the galactic core, where the Devourers had built their primary hive installations, using the compressed matter of consumed worlds and the energy signatures of destroyed civilizations that had been converted into raw materials for cosmic construction projects. The Devourer entities that defended their stronghold discovered that the humans who attacked them were no longer the primitive defenders they had faced at Earth, but had evolved into something that fought with a savagery that made their own cosmic ruthlessness seem gentle by comparison. Sandra's Marines fought through the hive stations with weapons that other species would have banned as war crimes, and they took no prisoners because they had learned that beings who consumed entire civilizations did not deserve mercy, and they refused to accept anything less than the complete extinction of their enemies. The dimensional warfare that erupted around the galactic core tore holes in spacetime that would take millions of years to heal, and the energy released by the battle between humans and cosmic entities created new stars and destroyed others as reality itself became a weapon in a conflict that defied every principle of civilized warfare. Admiral Jennifer Clark coordinated the dimensional siege that trapped the remaining Devourer entities in a pocket of collapsed space-time where they could not escape and could not use their cosmic powers to manipulate reality, and were forced to face weapons that had been specifically designed to kill biological organisms with quantum consciousness matrices. The Devourer hive mind experienced terror for the first time in its existence as it realized that the beings attacking them possessed something that no other galactic civilization had ever developed, which was the absolute determination to pursue their enemies across interstellar space and hunt them down regardless of the Costar Web's final virus, was released into the dimensional prison that contained the trapped entities, and it spread through their collective consciousness like a plague that attacked the quantum bonds holding their hive mind together and caused them to experience individual death for the first time in 10 million years. The cosmic entities tried to surrender when they realized that they were facing extinction, but humanity had learned about mercy from studying the fate of 17 civilizations that had begged for their lives before being consumed. And the answer was the same that the Devourers had given to billions of innocent beings. General Paul Jackson led the pursuit forces that followed fleeing entities across interstellar space, and his troops showed the same relentless determination that their species had once used to hunt extinct megafauna and explore hostile continents and establish colonies on worlds that tried to kill them. The final battle took place in the void between galaxies where no stars shone and no planets offered refuge, and their humanity proved something that the cosmic community had never suspected, which was that the most dangerous predator in the universe was often the one that had once been hunted. Admiral Kelly Green transmitted the final message back to Earth from the battlefield where the last Devourer entities had been destroyed, and her words were simple and direct and carried the weight of a species that had saved the galaxy by becoming something that their enemies feared more than death. The threat had been eliminated, and the galaxy was safe, but every surviving civilization understood that the balance of power had shifted permanently, because humanity had not just defeated the Devourers but had demonstrated capabilities that made them the new apex species in known space. The beings who had once begged humanity for help now watched the skies nervously and wondered what these terrifying saviors might do next, because they had revealed something about human nature that changed the fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species interacted with each other. The galaxy had begged for help, and humanity had answered that plea, but in unleashing their fury against cosmic entities that threatened all life they had shown that salvation sometimes came with teeth, and that the species willing to fight hardest for peace were often the ones most capable of waging total war. The refugee fleets that returned to reclaim their destroyed worlds found human ships patrolling the space lanes and ensuring that no new threats emerged from the dark spaces between stars, and they realized that Earth's protection came with the implicit understanding that humanity was now the galaxy's ultimate authority. The cosmic balance had shifted, and the species that had once been dismissed as primitive newcomers were now recognized as the beings who would decide the fate of civilizations and the future of known space, because they had proven that they possessed something more dangerous than any weapon, which was the willingness to use whatever force was necessary to protect what they considered worth defending.